Codename Kids Next Door is one of those shows that I feel gets lost in the mix, and people don't really talk about how influential it may have been to its viewers. To this day, it's one of my favorite Cartoon Network shows, and the subjects that it tackled in some of its episodes still hold that same shock value that it did when we were children. Like, do you remember that episode that essentially put substance abuse in the limelight, with a borderline alcoholic villain imprisoning kids from the neighborhood? To think, it all started with an age-based ban on soda. The story in question was actually part of the first episode in Season 2, dubbed Operation P.O.P. It was set what seemed to be a few weeks or possibly months after an odd law was put into effect that changed the legal drinking age of soda to 13. That's right, in this universe, the adults supposedly put a ban on soda, which seemed to trigger the same events as the alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. In fact, that's what the acronym Operation P.O.P. stood for in the episode title. It was Preteens Oppose Prohibition. I don't know about you, but tackling the concept of prohibition in what was meant to be a kids show is pretty hardcore if you ask me. By this point in the Kids Next Door universe, because of the soda prohibition, it seemed like a bunch of underground soda bars had popped up all over town. That's right, I'm talking about speakeasies. These soda bars were designed for children to have a safe and secret place to indulge in one of the greatest delicacies that any kid could have, an ice cold mug of root beer. Much like speakeasies in the real world though, the proprietor of the establishment would need to find a way to get the illegal substance, in this case soda, into the bar without the authorities finding out. This is where the Kids Next Door came in, specifically Numbuh 2. As the best pilot in all of the KND, he was the perfect choice to protect, transport, and deliver the root beer to the underground bars, and it was a role that he seemed to fall into seamlessly. At the beginning of the episode, that child bartender, yeah, you heard that right, actually offered Hoagie a mug of root beer on the house. To this, Numbuh 2 replied, "I never say no to a cold one." Now, if that's not a sign of future alcoholism, I don't know what is. All the kids in the speakeasy seemed to be enjoying themselves, but that peace wouldn't last long. Can you guess who broke up the party? It's the Fuzz! Wait, no, I mean Fizz. Mr. Fizz. As the kids were enjoying themselves, chaos suddenly broke out as the door was blown off the hinges and some sort of authority group crashed the party. The kids started throwing tables and scattered like they were a bunch of underage college students caught drinking at a party. But remember, in this instance, it's just root beer, although it's pretty obvious that the show is referencing alcohol. And get ready, because it's about to get even more obvious as Mr. Fizz enters the equation. As all of the kids were being rounded up, a man made his way into the center of the room, causing it to fall silent. The man walked right up to Numbuh 2, he grabbed his mug and took a sip before ominously declaring that it was root beer. After drinking a sip of the soda, Mr. Fizz vowed that he would have all of the children locked up for breaking the rules set in place by the Soda Control Act. Here's the kicker though. As he's watching his men take the children away, he slyly chugged the entire mug of root beer. Remember that moment because it's only the first of many indicators that Mr. Fizz had a substance abuse problem and was projecting onto others. Operation P.O.P. continued by showing Numbuh 2 sitting in an interrogation room, with Mr. Fizz sitting across from him. The two share some banter as Hoagie believed that there was no evidence that they could use against him. However, I guess he didn't know that they had documents proving that he was in possession of 20,000 gallons of soda. Where do you even put that much soda? What's worse is that they got my boy on intent to sell, and anyone can tell you that distribution charges are no joking matter. Numbuh 2 didn't seem to be shaken up by Mr. Fizz's accusations, which is where his secret weapon comes in. What's the one thing that could bother Numbuh 2 more than anything? Messing with his family and friends, which was exactly what Mr. Fizz planned to do. He surprised Numbuh 2 by showing him that no one would be coming to his rescue, not even his teammates in the Kids Next Door. Mr. Fizz had his cronies bring in Numbuhs 1, 3, 4, and 5 to prove that they had all been arrested on soda-related charges and were going to be locked up just like the rest of the kids. Mr. Fizz then approached Numbuh 2 and demanded some answers, to which Numbuh 2 defiantly replied by saying, "Go suck on a straw." Again, like a bunch of drunk college kids, his friends were in the background hyping up his rebellious attitude. And this is actually what sets off another indicator that Mr. Fizz had a problem that he wasn't not ready to talk about. As the Kids Next Door members were all yelling and being rowdy after Numbuh 2 stood up for himself, you can see Mr. Fizz getting overwhelmed. But it seems like a bit more than just being overwhelmed. It's more like he's experiencing some sort of sensory overload. It's at this point that he yelled and walked out of the room to a very strange-looking water dispenser. Instead of dispensing water, though, it was clearly filled with root beer that Mr. Fizz proceeded to chug as a way to calm his nerves. Once again, this is very similar to how an alcoholic would calm their nerves, by quickly knocking back a few drinks. Now, as Mr. Fizz was indulging himself, he gave the kids just enough time to make a break for it, and by the time he realized it, they were already out of the room and on the run. Now, believe it or not, this story actually has a few more twists in store. Remember how, at the beginning of the story, Mr. Fizz was having all the children taken away to be locked up? Well, when the kids learned the truth about what was happening to the locked up children, they realized things were far more serious than they originally thought. As the kids next door are trying to make a break for it, they found themselves in what appeared to be a bottling plant. Only instead of bottling up beverages, Mr. Fizz was bottling up the captured kids. His plan was to keep them bottled up until they matured into teenagers and he could release them. It was like some weird level of control that he needed to have over the kids, along with not allowing them to drink soda. Now, I know I sound like a broken record, but again, this is an uber sign of alcoholism in Mr. Fizz. Many alcoholics tend to be very controlling, and sometimes even manipulative in order to get what they want. In this case, seems like Mr. Fizz wants to keep all of the children away so they can't annoy or bother him as he enjoys his constant supply of root beer. The kids next door took it upon themselves to stop the bottling process, but before they could save any of the children, they once again found themselves going head-to-head against Mr. Fizz. Only this time, he wasn't fighting them unarmed. After confronting the kids and realizing that he wasn't going to be able to stop them on his own, Mr. Fizz promptly yelled the word soda, and then like Iron Man, he summoned a suit made out of soda barrels and bottles. Then like Bane from Batman huffing on his venom, Mr. Fizz chugged soda through a mask before attacking the kids next door. Now, how are the kids next door supposed to compete with an adult in a mini soda-based mech suit? Well, much like it started, it will all come down to Numbuh 2 and his ability to shake up Mr. Fizz. Literally. As Mr. Fizz began fighting the kids next door, the kids all separated from each other to perform different tasks. While Numbuhs 2 and 3 were sent to stop the conveyor belt, Numbuhs 1 and 5 worked on freeing Numbuh 4, who had been stuck to the conveyor belt by Mr. Fizz's sticky soda attacks. Mr. Fizz was aware that they split up and turned his attention to Numbuh 3, but right before he could target her with one of his attacks, Numbuh 2 threw a bottle at him. The bottle hit Mr. Fizz, changing the trajectory of his attack, which would have been a good thing if it hadn't hit Numbuh 1 instead. One by one, all of the kids next door operatives found themselves bottled up by Mr. Fizz thanks to Numbuh 2's clumsiness at that moment. The only two people who had been left unbottled at this point were Mr. Fizz and Numbuh 2, which obviously frustrated the young pilot. In his frustration, Numbuh 2 hit the lever that restarted the conveyor belt, and what he noticed gave him a great idea. He noticed that Mr. Fizz stumbled when the belt changed direction, which prompted Hoagie to keep changing the direction by flipping the lever back and forth. This caused the conveyor belt to shake up Mr. Fizz's soda suit in a buildup of the carbonation. Then, like putting Mentos into a bottle of Coke, Mr. Fizz's armor exploded, which seemed to put an end to his schemes. The episode ended on a positive note, kind of. Numbuh 2 was holding one of Mr. Fizz's soda cannons to his head as he forced the villain to open up all of the bottles and release the children one by one as he searched for the kids next door operatives. All in all, it was a really funny episode, but it's hard to deny the idea that Mr. Fizz was meant to represent a controlling adult who clearly had a substance abuse problem. Even if this wasn't something that was meant for children to understand and more of a hidden joke for adults, Mr. Fizz's habits in the episode provide insight into real-life substance abuse habits. The creation of his character in general was a really great way for the creators of Codename Kids Next Door to connect further with their older audience who might know someone like Mr. Fizz, or maybe even recognize that behavior within themselves. Substance abuse is a real problem that affects more than 16% of adults in the United States, and it's always interesting to see how children's cartoons tackle the subject. What do you think, though? Was Mr. Fizz really the kids next door version of an alcoholic, or was the entire episode just a parody of how some parents treat soda and sugary snacks around their kids? Be sure to let me know in the comments below.